Hi, everybody. My name's Christy. I am a graduate student at Duke University. I am studying genetics, and Zach asked me to come on here to tell you guys a little bit about genetics in general, and then explain a little bit about my work with the quail that I actually get from Zach. So let's get into it. We're going to start by talking about a couple of more general topics in biology, and then we're going to get to some genetics once we've covered that. So first, I want you to be able to understand why it is that we need genetics to understand our bodies, animals, plants, other living creatures on Earth. So you are entirely made up of things called cells. So I'm drawing that as one circle inside of another. That outer circle is the cell. And the cell is essentially just a tiny, tiny machine. A machine. Okay, so from there, how do machines work? They need instructions, usually some kind of onboard computer or something like that. So this little circle on the inside is our brain. That is the nucleus. And so the nucleus functions as the brain. It contains the instructions. So that is represented here as these X's. Now, if we were to zoom in on those X's, they look kind of like this, little swirly, kind of solid bodies. So this is actually called a chromosome. And a chromosome is just condensed DNA. And we condense it because if you were to stretch out all of your DNA, a human's DNA, into a straight single line, it would be about 6 feet long. And it needs to fit into something that's smaller than a hair shaft. And so it's very, very difficult to kind of encapsulate what that means, but it's an incredibly efficient storage system that holds all of that information in a teeny, teeny, tiny package in a way that still allows it to be functional, still allows it to be copied when necessary, and so on. So we have our condensed DNA in the form of chromosomes, and for humans, this is 23 pairs of chromosomes that make up everything that is an instruction on how to be a human for a cell. And then if you were to expand this out even more, I'm just going to draw DNA like this. It's a double-stranded piece of DNA. And this is our DNA. And this is essentially just the written instructions in their raw form. So these are our instructions. And in this case, the instructions give very explicit instructions to the machine. And then the machine will take those instructions and produce and use energy to do its tasks, whatever those may be. And so the really cool part of this is that with the same set of instructions in every single cell of your body, you can simultaneously have a brain cell, which will represent like this, very crude drawing, and that's for your brain. And with the same set of instructions, you can have a cell that makes up your blood, which carries oxygen. This cell, its job is to move signals through the brain so that you can think, you can remember, you can see, you can hear. The blood cell's job is to carry oxygen. So two incredibly different functions, and yet somehow using the exact same set of instructions, we can end up in these two different places in every single body. And the way that they do that is by not using the entire set of instructions in every single one. And so there are very specific parts of DNA that make up the instructions that tell something to be a brain cell. And there are other completely separate parts that tell a blood cell how to do its job and what to produce and how to use its energy. And so that is the overarching idea behind what the function of DNA is. It's essentially just a set of instructions that tells a machine, which is the cell, how to do its job. And in this case, it's allowing signals in the brain. And in this case, it's carrying oxygen. So you'll remember that I said that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And for simplicity's sake, instead of calling them chromosomes here, we will just call these two sets of instructions. And each set of instructions comprises 23 chromosomes, but we have effectively two sets of instructions in every single cell of our body. And this is for a lot of reasons, which if people want to ask questions about that, we'll happily follow those up in a future video answering all of those questions. But for simplicity's sake, two sets of instructions for every single cell in the body. Now we're going to talk a little bit about reproduction, which is the most important job of any species to exist. There is no species unless that species is reproducing. And so this is a huge field of study for DNA, for genetics, for biology. This is an incredibly active area of research, but I will tell you like what we do know for sure at this point. We won't go too far into the weeds. So in general terms, the females of the species, we'll call them mom here, will produce what's called an egg. So an egg is an incredibly specialized cell, which contains only 50% of the amount of DNA required in any other cell type. So in this case, we're going to refer to that as one set of instructions. So an egg has one set. And that is one of the very interesting aspects of biology in this area, is that unlike every other cell type, these cells have only half of the amount of genetic information that they would typically need. So in mom's case, she produces eggs, they have one set of DNA. In dad's case, he produces sperm, which also has one set of DNA. So as you can imagine, these two combine to create offspring, which has two sets of DNA in a single cell initially. So these combine, which causes these to combine and produces an offspring with two sets of DNA, one set inherited from mom and one set inherited from dad. So now we have a single solitary cell. This is offspring at this point that has an entirely unique genetic sequence that has never existed before and can never exist again, fundamentally. So this is, by its nature, unique. And we can get into the mechanisms of why it's unique if anybody wants to dive into that in a future explanation. I'm happy to do so. But for the scope of this, they are fundamentally a unique animal. So now, because bird reproduction is quite different from human reproduction, we're going to talk about bird reproduction specifically. So for humans, a fully formed egg matures in the ovary roughly once a month. And that egg is released in a mature state from the ovary directly. For birds, it is a very different story. So let's talk about bird reproduction. So mature chickens, female chickens, will produce a yolk from their ovary roughly once a day. So we'll write that down. So this is a yolk. One mature yolk is produced every day from a healthy adult female bird, at least chicken and, in this case, quail. Once a yolk has been produced, it will then, at the top of the reproductive tract, encounter sperm, if sperm is there. And this will fertilize it if there is sperm. If there is no sperm, it will not be fertilized and it will pass through as an unfertilized egg. Either way, the story is the same from here. So after it potentially encounters sperm, but mostly just after it's released from the ovary, the yolk is then encased by what we know as egg white. And first, it's actually encased by thick albumin. So this is, if you've ever noticed that the egg actually has a very thick egg white very close to the yolk, and then thinner egg white on the outside, first the thick albumin is laid down. And then, as it traverses the reproductive tract, the thin albumin is laid down, effectively looks the same, and then the shell is produced around the egg. So this is now an eggshell. Yeah. So we now have an egg, which contains a yolk and white, and is or is not fertilized at this point. Now, another cool thing about bird reproduction is that by the time that the egg has been laid by the mother, it has already been fertilized for roughly 20 hours. We'll call this post-fertilization. So at this point, instead of just a single unique cell, we now have about or more than 20,000 cells of this animal in this egg, if it's been fertilized, of course. In the egg. Now, this is a really cool place for research, because essentially every single day, you're producing a completely unique set of DNA. And that gives you a lot of opportunity to study the differences between birds in the same species, and for that matter, between species of birds. And so in this case, yes, if within 20 hours, it's 20,000 cells, but this will grow up under the right conditions to be a fully developed bird in most cases. And so you then have a unique animal from whatever cross you've made that you can get DNA from non-invasively and see what this bird looks like, see how its features are different from other birds, see how the features are similar to their parents or different from their parents. And that will tell you how the genomes of the parents interact with each other, what new features they'll produce with these unique genomes, which is just really a phrase that encapsulates all of the DNA and its interactions. So it's a really unique area of study, particularly because bird reproduction is so robust and so consistent. So this is where I kind of come in. Let's talk about quails specifically. Which in their case, from laying to hatching, takes 16 days under the right conditions. And so the right conditions means the correct humidity and the correct temperature. Typically, incubators will tilt quail eggs at certain intervals, and this helps a lot in their development, I've noticed, and it's pretty common knowledge in bird rearing as well. So in about 16 days from laying, the quails will hatch. And then once they've hatched, they will take roughly 6 weeks to reach maturity, at which point they will start to lay eggs and produce sperm. And this is roughly, I'd say about 6 to 8. They're pretty comfortable. Usually the females are slightly behind, but very slightly. And then you're producing eggs basically every day for several years. And this is the experience that I've had with Zach's quail. And I'm sure Zach has talked about it before with all of you. So I'm sure a lot of you have noticed in your day-to-day life, birds in general are able to fly. They have feathers, they have talons, they have beaks that are very different. All of those things are very different structurally from other animals. And that's another reason why birds are so interesting, besides the fact that they have the cool things that I've listed already. They also have these very unique features to them. And biologists, we've studied a lot of things. We know a lot of reasons behind a lot of the features that we see in everyday life, and especially in humans, but we have genuinely very little idea what it is that has created these features in birds, whereas other animals show none of these features. And so feathers, what parts of DNA produce them, what parts of DNA control their coloring, their shape and size, because throughout the body of the quail, there are different types of feathers which have different patterns. And I'm sure if you've seen any like nature documentaries, you know that certain parts of certain feathers are colored in certain ways. They're different from the rest of the feather. And so it's this very complex interaction, even just when we're talking about feathers. But on top of that, birds' beaks are very unique. They have odd teeth that most, if not all, other animals do not have. They have very different bone structure. Obviously, they have very different arm structure because their arm has become a wing structurally that can support their weight, that can fly. A lot of bone structure has changed because of all of these changes. And so structurally and fundamentally, they are incredibly different to a lot of other animals on the earth. And so having their DNA and studying their DNA compared to each other and compared to other animals tells us a lot about what parts of the DNA might be controlling these things. Let's talk about, for example, comparing an emu, a very large flightless bird, to a pigeon. Very common. Everyone knows what a pigeon looks like. Emus have incredibly tiny wings. They cannot fly, but not only can they not fly, their wings are very, very, very small compared to the rest of their body. You can go ahead and Google an emu skeleton. You'll see that's super, super tiny. Whereas a pigeon, fully capable of flight, has proportional wing, functions as we anticipate birds to function in just normal, everyday, talking about birds. So now this puts us in a position where we classify these two things as birds, and yet they're very different. And so we can understand the differences in the DNA, and that helps shed light on why it is that these are two structurally very different animals. And so, like I said, the DNA instructions tell the cells to make this bird not be able to fly, to have it have small wings, so not normal wings. And they make it really big. Whereas for pigeons, the instructions say yes, we can fly. Yeah, we're going to make a normal wing. And we're not going to make it very big. We're going to make it pretty small. Going to be a nice, reasonable size for the pigeons, as opposed to the emus. And so we can compare these two and try to figure out what parts of the DNA might tell a bird that it's able to fly and tell the cells to be able to make a wing that can fly versus a wing that cannot fly. We can also compare the DNA in order to tell us what parts of it might be controlling how big this bird is. And so that's another thing that I'm really interested in, is size control in birds and the DNA control behind the size control of birds, which is a very complex trait in general. As I'm sure you've noticed in your everyday life, humans are all very different sizes. It's very complex how those sizes are determined, and how the DNA interacts with itself to create that height. And so it's a very similar situation in birds, along with these other complex traits. And so you have this situation where there's roughly 10,000 bird species. And if you compare enough of them, you can kind of eliminate the parts of their DNA that aren't important to look at in terms of understanding these important features, and figure out what parts of the DNA are really important to understand these features. Thank you guys for listening, and thanks, Zach, for having me. I had a really good time teaching you guys a little bit something about genetics. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them down below, and me and Zach will go through them and answer some in the future. Bye.